In 1878, in the heart of Hungary, an asylum opened its doors with promises of care and recovery for the mentally ill. However, what unfolded within its stone walls was a chilling and inexplicable horror. Patients entering this institution did not just face the struggle of their own minds, they shared a fate so grim that it became known as the final sentence. It wasn't a sentence handed down by a court, nor one written by any judge. It was a fate marked by death, a fate eerily shared by so many within its confines. Imagine a place where individuals, trapped by their own mental afflictions, found themselves bound not just by their conditions but by an ominous pattern of death. What began as a facility for healing soon descended into something darker, a place where the walls seemed to echo with the same fate for its inhabitants, the final sentence of death. But what was it about this asylum that caused so many lives to end in such a brutal, unexplained fashion? Was it the result of systemic failures? Or was there something far more sinister at play? The concept of the final sentence was not a widely discussed topic in the world of mental health, especially in the 19th century, where treatment was still in its infancy. What happened behind those iron gates? What led to the deaths of so many individuals, and why did they appear to share such a haunting commonality? As the years passed, the asylum's reputation grew, but not for the reasons anyone would have hoped. This was not a place of recovery. It became, for many, the final chapter of their life story. Yet, as time passed, the story of these deaths and the sinister pattern they followed would become a topic of obsession and horror for many, even though its full truth remained buried for far too long. The first thing to grasp is that the final sentence was not simply a phrase used by historians or psychologists to describe a series of deaths. It was something much more personal. These patients didn't just die, they were condemned to die, not by any crime they committed, but by the very system that was meant to care for them. There were no official charges against them, no executions by the state. Their sentence was one of institutional neglect, ignorance, and perhaps something more, something far darker. This final sentence was woven into the very fabric of the asylum, seeping through its corridors and into the souls of those who lived there. And, in many ways, it was a sentence passed on by the institution itself. As unsettling as it might sound, death was not an accidental occurrence within these walls. It wasn't a mere consequence of the conditions, though those were appalling enough. There was a disturbing pattern that began to emerge, a pattern too consistent to be mere coincidence. The patients, many of whom had entered the asylum with only the hope of healing or relief from their ailments, found themselves confronting something far worse, a systematic failure that turned their lives into little more than a ticking clock, counting down to a tragic, inevitable end. The similarities between these deaths were too precise to dismiss. The manner of death, the timing, the symptoms leading up to it, it all pointed to a deeply unsettling reality. These individuals were not simply suffering from their own minds, they were victims of a system that seemed to play a far more active role in sealing their fates. What made this even more chilling was the secrecy that shrouded the deaths. As with many dark stories of the past, there was a deliberate effort to hide what was happening. Those in charge, including the medical staff and government officials, seemed determined to suppress the truth. The asylum's horrifying legacy was not something it wanted exposed to the public. The very idea that patients were dying under such mysterious and unnatural circumstances would have been devastating to the institution's credibility. So, the deaths were often swept under the rug, brushed off as part of the usual course of mental illness, or worse, ignored altogether. This obfuscation only added to the eerie nature of the asylum. What were they hiding? Why were these deaths left unexplained? Who benefited from the silence? The patients, trapped in this cycle of despair, had no voice. They were powerless. Many were sent by families who no longer knew how to deal with their afflictions, while others were committed by courts or legal authorities. These individuals were often regarded with disdain or fear by society, labeled as mad or dangerous, even when their conditions may have been misunderstood or poorly treated. Once inside the asylum, they were subjected to an environment of neglect, where the priority was not care or healing but control. The building itself was not designed for comfort. It was a fortress, built to keep people in, not to heal them. The rooms were cold, the air stale, and the beds were often little more than straw mats. For many of the patients, the asylum was a final, oppressive prison from which there was no escape. As the years dragged on, the number of deaths began to rise. It started with just a few, patients who passed away from complications, illness, or the weight of their own mental distress. But the trend didn't stop there. More and more patients met the same fate, sudden, mysterious deaths. There was no clear cause, but the pattern grew undeniable. Some died quickly after entering the asylum, others after only a few months. They were marked by the same symptoms: a decline in physical health, sudden lethargy, and then, inevitably, death. Doctors, nurses, and attendants reported nothing particularly strange about these cases. But to anyone paying attention, the similarities between them were impossible to ignore. Was it just poor care? Or was something far more sinister at play? At the time, mental health treatments were primitive, often bordering on barbaric by today's standards. Doctors were still experimenting with methods that we now know to be ineffective or even harmful. Yet, despite this, there were whispers among the staff. Some patients began to disappear from sight altogether, and those who survived spoke of harsh treatments, of being left alone in dark rooms for days at a time. There were rumors of patients being injected with mysterious substances, their health deteriorating rapidly after a seemingly harmless visit to the doctor. The once hopeful idea of recovery had become a nightmare of neglect, and death was no longer an anomaly, it had become a tragic expectation. As more and more patients shared this fate, the asylum's reputation began to spread, albeit in hushed tones. Those who survived its horrors left with nothing but the memories of a place where death hung in the air, a place where the very concept of life seemed to be slipping away with each passing day. The facility that had been designed to offer refuge had become a place of doom, a factory for death that crushed hope at every turn. And so, the final sentence was not something that could be explained away. It wasn't merely a tragic coincidence that so many died in such a strange and disturbing manner. It was a fate marked by secrecy, by fear, and by a broken system that turned its back on the very people it was supposed to care for. These patients were not merely statistics or faceless victims. They were real individuals, trapped in a web of psychological and institutional horror, bound to die not because of their conditions but because of the institution that was meant to protect them. The truth, as it would later be uncovered, was that the asylum had become a place of psychological horror, a place where patients didn't just battle their own minds but the very forces that were meant to care for them. And that fact, hidden for so long, would eventually become its own dark legacy. The story of the asylum in Hungary, where patients shared the same final sentence, is deeply entwined with the cultural and medical history of the late 19th century. To understand how such horrors unfolded within its walls, it's essential to first examine the origins of the institution itself. As the asylum's doors opened in 1878, it became a symbol of hope for many families struggling to care for their loved ones who were suffering from mental illness. But as time would reveal, that hope quickly descended into something far darker. To understand the trajectory of the asylum's descent into chaos, one must understand the societal and medical context of the time, when mental health care was still in its infancy, where scientific understanding was rudimentary, and where ignorance often dictated how the mentally ill were treated. In the late 1800s, the understanding of mental health was not what it is today. Psychological disorders were often seen through the lens of superstition and moral failings. People suffering from conditions like depression, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder were frequently seen as possessed, immoral, or even criminal. Asylums, such as the one in Hungary, were often conceived with the best of intentions. They were meant to be places where the mentally ill could be cared for, away from the public eye, where they could receive treatment and be kept from the perceived dangers they posed to themselves and society. At first glance, these institutions promised refuge for the afflicted, offering the hope of healing. However, the reality was far from the vision of care that had been promised. The late 19th century marked a time of great change in Europe, both socially and medically. Mental health care was undergoing a shift from a purely custodial approach, where patients were simply locked away, to a more therapeutic model that sought to treat mental illness. This shift was largely inspired by the moral treatment movement, which emerged in the early 1800s. This movement, led by figures like Philippe Pinel in France, advocated for more humane treatment of the mentally ill. The idea was that patients could be rehabilitated through kindness, structure, and moral guidance. Asylums were meant to be therapeutic havens, where patients would receive the care they needed to heal. Yet, while the ideals behind the moral treatment movement were well-intentioned, the reality was often quite different. The rise of asylums in the 19th century coincided with increasing industrialization, social upheaval, and a growing sense of fear surrounding mental illness. As society began to industrialize and urbanize, the number of people diagnosed with mental illnesses began to rise, putting tremendous strain on institutions that were already poorly equipped to deal with the complexities of mental health. Many asylums, including the one in Hungary, were overwhelmed by overcrowding, underfunding, and a lack of qualified medical personnel. What had begun as a beacon of hope for those struggling with mental illness soon became little more than a warehouse for human suffering. The asylum in Hungary, which initially promised a better life for its patients, was no different. Its founders likely envisioned a place of healing, a refuge for those whose minds had been broken by society or life's tragedies. However, as more and more patients were admitted, the institution quickly became overwhelmed. The very system that was meant to heal instead became a mechanism of control and confinement. The building itself was designed not for comfort or healing but for containment. Its cold stone walls, the thick iron bars on the windows, and the dark, narrow corridors all spoke to the underlying message. These individuals were to be isolated, removed from the world, and controlled. The physical structure of the asylum mirrored the broader societal view of the mentally ill at the time, a view that saw them as dangerous, unpredictable, and incapable of leading productive lives. The patients who entered the asylum were often those whom society had turned its back on. Families, unable to care for relatives who were suffering from mental illness, sent them away in the hopes of receiving some semblance of treatment. Many of these individuals had been misunderstood, diagnosed with conditions that were poorly understood or entirely misdiagnosed. Depression was often labeled as madness, and those suffering from schizophrenia or psychosis were seen as threats to the social order. Asylums like the one in Hungary became dumping grounds for these individuals, many of whom had been abandoned by their families or deemed unfit for society. As time went on, the asylum in Hungary became a reflection of the medical and societal attitudes toward the mentally ill during this period. The patients were treated with a mixture of neglect and superstition. Doctors and staff, many of whom lacked the training and knowledge to properly treat these individuals, relied on outdated and often cruel methods of care. The treatment of the mentally ill in asylums during this time was largely based on trial and error. There were no standardized approaches to mental health care, and what little knowledge existed was often poorly applied. Patients were subjected to treatments that we now recognize as both ineffective and inhumane, including bloodletting, forced isolation, and physical restraints. The patients who arrived at the Hungarian asylum were often treated with little regard for their humanity. Many were subjected to harsh treatments, such as being chained to walls or locked away in small, dark cells. The use of restraints was common, as was the practice of using electroconvulsive therapy, which was in its early stages of development and was often applied without any real understanding of its effects. For those who were deemed especially dangerous, lobotomies were sometimes performed, a procedure that removed parts of the brain in an attempt to cure mental illness. These practices were not only ineffective but often worsened the patient's conditions, leading to further degradation and suffering. The medical staff, although well-meaning, were often overwhelmed and undertrained. They were tasked with managing large numbers of patients, many of whom had complex and diverse needs. The sheer number of people admitted to the asylum overwhelmed the resources available, and as a result, the quality of care suffered. The asylum staff were often ill-equipped to handle the mental health crisis before them, and their attempts at treatment were often little more than a facade to justify their actions. The asylum, rather than being a place of healing, became a place of containment, a prison for the mind, where individuals were left to suffer in silence. Despite these grim conditions, there was an undeniable hope among some of the staff that the asylum could one day fulfill its original purpose. However, this hope was marred by the overwhelming realization that the institution, as it stood, was not capable of providing the care that was needed. The patients, many of whom were suffering from conditions that were little understood, were left to rot in an environment that only exacerbated their suffering. For those who were committed to the asylum, life became a slow, agonizing wait for death. In a sense, the asylum itself became the executioner, its walls closing in around those who entered, their lives reduced to nothing more than a grim waiting game. As the years passed, the asylum's failure to meet its goals became more and more apparent. The promise of recovery had long since faded, and the reality of life within its walls had become unbearable. Patients continued to die, many of them under mysterious circumstances. The pattern of death grew increasingly disturbing, with more and more patients sharing the same final sentence. It was not merely the result of poor care or neglect. There was something more sinister at work, something buried deep within the asylum's history, a dark secret that would eventually come to light. But for many of the patients, the truth would never be known, and their deaths would remain shrouded in mystery, a legacy of a broken system that had failed them at every turn. The story of the asylum in Hungary, and the patients who found themselves trapped within its walls, serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and ignorance. It reflects the dark history of mental health care, a time when society's understanding of mental illness was minimal, and the treatment of those afflicted was often more about control than compassion. It is a story that speaks to the enduring consequences of neglect, a story of individuals whose lives were torn apart by a system that promised care but delivered only suffering. And in the end, it is a story that remains unfinished, its echoes still haunting the halls of history. The patients who entered the asylum in Hungary were not just numbers on a chart, nor were they mere cases to be studied. They were real people, individuals with histories, emotions, and lives that had been uprooted by mental illness, misunderstood diagnoses, or the overwhelming forces of society. Many of them had families, hopes, and dreams before their lives were overshadowed by the institution's cold, stone walls. Some entered seeking help, others were abandoned by those they loved. But once inside, they found themselves in a place where their humanity was stripped away, and they were reduced to little more than the condition they carried with them. The stories of these patients, who endured unimaginable suffering, reflect not only the cruelty of the asylum system but the profound misunderstanding of mental health that prevailed at the time. One patient, a young woman named Maria, had been committed to the asylum by her family after suffering from what was believed to be a nervous breakdown. She had always been an anxious person, but the pressures of her life, the loss of a parent, the weight of financial instability, and the strain of a loveless marriage, had pushed her to the edge. At first, Maria had been able to hide her inner turmoil, but over time, the fear and anxiety that consumed her grew uncontrollable. She became withdrawn, unable to engage with the world around her. Her once vibrant personality faded, and she began to suffer from frequent episodes of crying, muttering to herself, and fits of uncontrollable shaking. Her family, desperate to find a solution, sought medical help, but the limited understanding of mental health during this time meant that Maria's condition was seen as a moral failing rather than a medical issue. The idea of depression or anxiety as a medical condition was still in its infancy, and many doctors believed that women, in particular, were prone to bouts of hysteria or nervous disorders, often linked to their perceived weakness or emotional instability. So, Maria was committed to the asylum, where she was subjected to treatments designed more to restrain her than to heal her. She was placed in a small, dimly lit room, surrounded by the incessant noise of the other patients, their cries echoing through the hallways. Despite the harsh conditions and the complete lack of privacy, Maria's family rarely visited her. She became a forgotten soul within the institution, her cries for help muffled by the walls of her small, dark cell. The isolation, coupled with the poor care she received, only worsened her condition. The treatments were crude and ineffective. She was subjected to physical restraints, kept in isolation for days at a time, and forced to endure what the medical staff considered necessary for her recovery. In truth, these measures were not designed to help her at all. They were meant to control her, to keep her quiet and compliant. Over time, Maria's mental and physical health deteriorated rapidly, and she eventually succumbed to the same fate as many others, an early death, the cause of which was never fully understood. Maria's story was not unique. Countless patients entered the asylum for reasons that ranged from the relatively benign, such as depression or anxiety, to the more severe conditions that were poorly understood at the time. Some were sent by families who could no longer cope with the stresses of caring for a mentally ill relative, while others were institutionalized by court orders or government mandates. Some were diagnosed with conditions that we now recognize as treatable, while others were simply labeled as insane without a clear understanding of their condition. But once they were inside the asylum, they were all subjected to the same cruel treatment, their personal histories and identities disregarded in favor of a system that saw them as little more than cases to be contained. Among the patients was a man named Victor, who had been a successful businessman before his life was shattered by what was then called mania. Victor's story was tragic, as it revealed not just the limitations of the medical system but also the social stigma surrounding mental illness at the time. Victor had been known for his sharp mind and his ability to run a successful business. But over time, his behavior began to change. He became erratic, unable to focus on his work, and his once keen judgment was clouded by irrational fears and extreme mood swings. His family, unable to understand the changes in his behavior, sought medical help. The doctors, unable to pinpoint the cause of his symptoms, labeled him as suffering from mania, a diagnosis that was vague and often used to describe a wide range of symptoms that were poorly understood. Rather than receiving the help he needed, Victor was placed in the asylum. His once promising life was reduced to little more than a series of visits from doctors who did not truly understand his condition. He was treated with various ineffective methods, from the use of harsh medications to electroconvulsive therapy. His family visited him infrequently, and when they did, they were often met with a man who had changed so drastically that they no longer recognized him. Victor's once vibrant personality had been dulled, his mind clouded by the treatments he had undergone. His story was not one of healing or recovery, but of gradual deterioration, as his mental state worsened in the cold, sterile environment of the asylum. In many ways, Victor's story was a reflection of the broader issues facing those who were committed to the asylum. The patients who entered the institution were often treated as a monolith, their individual conditions reduced to labels that did little to address the complexity of their struggles. The staff, overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients, could do little more than administer harsh treatments and lock the patients away in their cells. For the patients, this environment was one of isolation and despair. They were cut off from the outside world, their families and friends unable to reach them. In some cases, patients never saw their families again after being committed. Their lives were reduced to a grim routine of medication, isolation, and, at best, minimal interaction with the staff. The lack of personal attention and the absence of any real therapeutic care only deepened the patient's sense of hopelessness. It became a vicious cycle. The patient's mental conditions worsened because of the treatment they received, which then led to even more severe methods being employed to control them. The result was a steady decline in the quality of life for those trapped within the asylum's walls. Over time, many of the patients became shadows of their former selves, their personalities erased by the treatments they endured. Their identities were obscured by the institution's relentless drive to control and contain them. These individuals were no longer seen as human beings but as cases to be managed, labeled, and dismissed. There was also a profound sense of shame that permeated the lives of many patients. The stigma of mental illness at the time was overwhelming, and the idea of being committed to an asylum carried with it a sense of disgrace. Families who sent their loved ones to the institution often did so out of a combination of desperation and fear. The patients, in turn, were left to grapple not just with their own mental health struggles but with the social isolation and humiliation that accompanied their institutionalization. For many, the asylum became a place not just of physical confinement, but of emotional and psychological torment. The patients were cut off from the world they had known, their lives reduced to nothing more than the confines of the institution. They were left to struggle with their own minds, with no real support and no one to turn to. Some patients, like Maria and Victor, experienced rapid declines in both their mental and physical health. Others, however, remained in the asylum for years, slowly withering away in an environment that offered them no hope. Their stories became part of the larger narrative of the asylum, a place where death and despair were not just common, but almost expected. The asylum was not a place of healing. It was a place where people went to disappear, to be forgotten. For many, the only certainty in their lives was that they would die within those walls, whether by neglect, mistreatment, or the slow unraveling of their own minds. It's important to remember that these patients were not just victims of an institution, but also of a society that had no understanding of mental illness. They were condemned not only by the asylum but by the ignorance and prejudice of the time. Their stories are a tragic reminder of the ways in which those who suffer from mental illness have been marginalized, dehumanized, and forgotten throughout history. The patients who died within the walls of the asylum were not just victims of an uncaring institution. They were victims of a system that refused to see them as people worthy of compassion, care, and understanding. Their lives and their deaths stand as a testament to the horrors that can arise when humanity is lost in the treatment of mental illness. Inside the asylum, life for the patients was marked by a sense of utter despair and helplessness. The physical environment of the institution, which was designed to isolate and contain, mirrored the mental and emotional conditions of those confined within. The cold, imposing stone walls stood like a fortress, an inescapable barrier between the patients and the outside world. The air within was thick with the smell of antiseptic and decay, a constant reminder of the sterile, oppressive atmosphere that pervaded every corner. It wasn't just the patients who were trapped within these walls. The asylum itself became a prison for the soul, where the very concept of freedom was lost to time. The asylum's architecture was clinical and unwelcoming. Long, narrow hallways wound through the building, lined with cells that were little more than cages for the mind. The rooms were small, bare, and devoid of any comfort. Each patient was confined to a single, dimly lit cell, where they were often left alone for hours or even days at a time. The lack of natural light added to the suffocating atmosphere, making it feel as though the days were indistinguishable from one another. Time seemed to stand still in the asylum. Patients lost track of when they had last seen their families, when they had last spoken to anyone outside the institution. In these dark corners, even the passage of time felt like a cruel illusion, a reminder that nothing would ever change for them. In many ways, the physical environment of the asylum was the perfect reflection of its treatment of patients. There was no attempt to make the place comfortable or homely. The rooms were furnished with only the barest essentials: a hard bed, a small table, and a chair. The beds were often nothing more than thin mattresses laid directly on the floor, offering little to no comfort. Patients who suffered from physical ailments or disabilities were often left to lie on the floor, unable to move or change positions, their bodies slowly wasting away. The lack of proper bedding, combined with the cold, damp conditions, made it nearly impossible for patients to get the rest they needed, further exacerbating their physical and mental deterioration. For many, sleep became a distant memory, an unattainable luxury that only further deepened their suffering. The walls of the asylum were not just barriers that separated the patients from the outside world, they were also the barriers between the patients and any sense of autonomy or dignity. Each patient cell was a place of forced isolation, where they were subjected to the whims of the staff and the harsh conditions of the environment. There were no private spaces within the asylum, no places for patients to engage with one another in any meaningful way. Social interaction was limited, as patients were discouraged from speaking to one another or even looking at each other. The isolation served to further strip away their sense of identity, reducing them to little more than the sum of their symptoms. The medical practices employed at the asylum were based more on control than care. Treatments were often harsh, invasive, and untested, with little regard for the well-being of the patients. One of the most common treatments was the use of physical restraints. Many patients were bound to their beds or strapped to chairs, unable to move or escape. These restraints were often used not out of necessity, but as a way to manage the patient's behavior, particularly those who were deemed violent or uncontrollable. The restraints, however, were not designed to prevent harm or offer protection. They were designed to subdue. The patients were treated as if they were animals to be controlled, rather than individuals in need of care and understanding. This sense of powerlessness only deepened the patient's sense of despair, making it impossible for them to regain any sense of autonomy or dignity. Those who were not physically restrained were often kept in solitary confinement, locked away in small, dark cells for long periods of time. The isolation served as a form of punishment, as well as a means of controlling the patients. For those who were already struggling with mental health issues, isolation was a cruel and inhumane practice. The lack of human interaction, combined with the oppressive environment, only worsened their conditions. Many patients began to lose their grip on reality, spiraling further into madness as they were left alone with their thoughts and fears. For some, this isolation was the breaking point, the final step in their descent into complete psychological disintegration. The silence of the asylum was deafening, broken only by the occasional cries or murmurs of other patients, whose suffering went largely unheard. The medical treatments that patients were subjected to in the asylum were, at best, primitive and ineffective, and at worst, harmful and abusive. The lack of understanding of mental illness during this time meant that doctors often resorted to methods that were not only unscientific but actively detrimental to the patient's health. One of the most common treatments was the use of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, which was still in its early stages of development. At the time, the procedure was poorly understood, and its effects were not fully documented. The patients who underwent this treatment were often subjected to painful, unpredictable shocks that caused temporary seizures. It was believed that this process would reset the brain and cure the patient of their afflictions, but in reality, it only served to further damage the already fragile minds of those who underwent it. The physical and emotional trauma caused by such treatments was immense, and many patients emerged from these sessions in a worse state than when they entered. In addition to electroshock therapy, there were other methods employed that were equally as harsh and unproven. Bloodletting, a treatment once widely used for a variety of ailments, was still practiced in some asylums during this period. The idea was that by draining the blood from the patient, the bad humors would be removed, and the patient would be cured. Of course, this had no scientific basis, and it often left patients weakened and vulnerable. The practice of bloodletting, combined with other forms of physical abuse, further contributed to the suffering of those within the asylum's walls. The staff members who carried out these treatments were often ill-equipped to deal with the patient's needs. Many of the attendants were poorly trained, and their understanding of mental health was limited at best. Most of the caregivers were not doctors but rather low-level staff who had little to no understanding of how to treat the patients they were tasked with overseeing. These individuals were often the ones who had to manage the daily lives of the patients, administering medications, overseeing meals, and maintaining order. They were not trained to understand the complex psychological issues that their patients faced. In many cases, the staff simply did what they were told without questioning the methods or practices that were being implemented. This lack of expertise and compassion meant that the patients were often left at the mercy of those who did not understand their conditions, or worse, those who were indifferent to their suffering. While some patients received what little care was available, many others were left to fend for themselves. The lack of staff and resources meant that the asylum was often underfunded and understaffed. The result was a system in which patients were often ignored, left to rot in their cells while the staff moved on to the next task. The patients' cries for help went unanswered, and their suffering went largely unnoticed. For many, the asylum became a place where hope went to die, where their lives were reduced to little more than a slow, agonizing wait for death. Despite the brutality and neglect, there were moments when the true horror of the asylum became clear. The silence that permeated the institution was occasionally broken by the sounds of screams, the desperate cries of patients who could no longer endure the cruelty they were subjected to. These moments of unrest were met with harsh punishment and further isolation. For those patients who dared to show any sign of resistance or emotional distress, the response was swift and severe. The staff, unable or unwilling to understand the root causes of the patient's pain, resorted to punitive measures to maintain control. The very idea of mental health care, in this context, became synonymous with oppression and suffering. For the patients, this was not just a matter of surviving the physical conditions of the asylum. It was a psychological battle against a system that viewed them as little more than cases to be controlled. The asylum, instead of being a place of healing, became a place of torment, where the patients were treated not as people, but as objects to be molded, contained, and discarded. Over time, the institution became a microcosm of the neglect and abuse that pervaded the treatment of the mentally ill in the late 19th century. And for those who were trapped within its walls, the hope of recovery was a distant dream, a dream that was all but crushed under the weight of the system's failures. The patients at the asylum were trapped not just by the physical and emotional confines of the institution, but also by a system that had stripped them of their autonomy and their voices. Within those cold walls, they had little chance of escape, not just from the facility itself, but from the broader societal forces that had cast them aside. For many, the asylum represented the final chapter in their lives, a place where they would be forgotten, left to wither away in the shadows. The overwhelming silence that greeted them upon entry, the lack of human interaction, and the consistent degradation of their mental and physical health ensured that the only thing that awaited them in the asylum was a slow, inevitable demise. For those who had entered with the hope of recovery, the asylum soon became their tomb. One of the most disturbing aspects of the asylum was its ability to break down the sense of self. The patients who entered the institution were often individuals with rich histories, people who had once been full of life, with families, careers, and aspirations. Yet, once inside, they were reduced to little more than their diagnosis, their symptoms, and their presumed inability to function in society. The identity that they had once known was gradually erased, not just by the harsh treatments, but by the environment itself. In many ways, the asylum functioned as a system of erasure, removing the individual from the narrative of their own life. Patients were reduced to categories of mental illness, locked away in cells where they could no longer hold on to their former selves. The human element was all but lost within the institution's rigid and dehumanizing structure. One patient, for example, named Elsa, had been committed to the asylum after a series of nervous breakdowns, which were attributed to the trauma of losing her child. She had been a loving mother, an active member of her community, and a woman full of vitality. However, after the tragic death of her son, Elsa's grief took on a devastating form. She became withdrawn, unable to care for herself or her remaining family. Desperate to help, her relatives brought her to the asylum, hoping that the doctors could help her regain her sense of balance and peace. But once inside, Elsa's story took a tragic turn. The asylum, with its bleak environment and oppressive treatment methods, was a far cry from the healing space her family had imagined. Instead of finding solace, Elsa found herself subjected to forced isolation, physical restraints, and cruel attempts at therapy that only worsened her condition. Elsa's breakdown was exacerbated by the harsh treatment she endured. In the dimly lit corners of the asylum, she was often left alone for long periods of time, staring into the dark walls, her mind unraveling further with each passing day. The treatment methods of the time, electroconvulsive therapy, isolation, and physical restraints, were ineffective at best and devastating at worst. For Elsa, these treatments did nothing to soothe her grief or help her regain her sense of self. Instead, they pushed her deeper into despair. The doctors, having no real understanding of her condition, used one-size-fits-all methods, applying the same brutal treatments to every patient, regardless of the uniqueness of their individual experiences. In many cases, the treatments themselves contributed to the patient's further breakdown, as they were forced to endure shock after shock, restraint after restraint, without any real understanding of how these measures affected their minds. But it wasn't just the physical treatments that tore at Elsa's sense of identity. It was the isolation, the separation from her family, the abandonment that came with being placed behind the walls of the asylum. She was not just removed from her community, she was erased from it. Her life, her hopes, and her dreams no longer mattered to anyone outside the asylum. She became a nameless, faceless patient in a long line of forgotten souls. Over time, she began to forget herself. The person she had been, the mother, the wife, the woman full of energy and love, was lost, replaced by the shell of someone who could not comprehend who they were anymore. She was a victim of both her circumstances and a system that cared only for the outward appearance of order, not the inner workings of the patient's minds. For those trapped within the asylum, there was a sense of abandonment that went far beyond the walls of the institution. Many of the patients were written off by their families and society. They were seen as burdens, objects to be locked away and forgotten. Family visits, if they occurred at all, were few and far between. The patients often faced not only the emotional devastation of their own illnesses but the crushing weight of isolation. They were sent to the asylum with the hope that they might recover, but in reality, they were left to rot in their cells. For some, the lack of visits from loved ones only deepened their sense of loneliness and desperation. They became ghosts, moving through the asylum like shadows of their former selves, forgotten by all but the walls that surrounded them. This sense of isolation was not just emotional, it was also physical. The asylum's architecture was designed to keep the patients apart, to segregate them into cells where they could be monitored but not heard. The design of the institution reinforced the idea that patients were to be contained, rather than cared for. The lack of communal spaces meant that the patients were isolated from each other as well. In a facility where human connection could have been a source of support and comfort, the patients were instead forced into silence. The only sounds that filled the air were the cries of those who had lost all hope, the shuffling footsteps of the attendants, and the clanging of doors as the patients were moved from one area to another. There was no camaraderie, no sense of solidarity between the patients. Each was alone in their suffering, trapped in a system that saw them as nothing more than cases to be dealt with. In this oppressive environment, the patient's mental health deteriorated further. For many, the absence of human connection, coupled with the harsh treatments they endured, led them to lose touch with reality altogether. Some patients experienced vivid hallucinations, others suffered from severe delusions. There were those who became catatonic, unable to respond to the outside world, and those who were driven to violent outbursts, often as a way of expressing the pain they could no longer articulate. But even these reactions were seen as problems to be managed, not as cries for help. The staff, overwhelmed and undertrained, had no answers for the patient's suffering. Instead, they employed methods designed to suppress symptoms, rather than to understand or address the root causes of the distress. As the years passed, the asylum became a place where hope was a distant memory. The patients who entered with the hope of recovery were left to languish in a system that offered them no real chance of healing. Some managed to survive for years in the institution, their bodies physically frail, their minds shattered by the experience. Others, like Elsa, were broken long before their time. The lack of care, the neglect, and the brutal treatment wore them down until they were little more than empty shells of their former selves. For many, the only way out of the asylum was death, an end to the misery they had endured for so long. The stories of these patients are a tragic testament to the failure of the asylum system and the wider societal neglect of those with mental illness. The institution that was meant to offer them solace and treatment instead became a place where they were forgotten and left to suffer in silence. The patients were not just casualties of an outdated system, they were victims of a society that had no place for the mentally ill, a society that saw them as nothing more than burdens to be hidden away. In the asylum, they lost their identities, their dignity, and their lives. Their stories remain a haunting reminder of the horrors that can arise when we turn our backs on those in need, when we fail to recognize the humanity in those who suffer from mental illness. The walls of the asylum may have kept the patients trapped inside, but it was the cruelty of the system itself that ultimately locked them away. The isolation within the asylum was not merely physical, it was deeply psychological. The patients, trapped in this environment, were subjected to a type of social and emotional erasure that extended far beyond the walls of their cells. The asylum was not only a prison for the body but also a prison for the mind. It was a place where the very concept of identity could be dissolved, reduced to the sterile label of mentally ill. The asylum, with its impersonal systems, became a place where the patients were treated as little more than cases to be managed, their individual stories lost in a sea of suffering. Over time, the isolation forced on them gradually turned them into shadows of their former selves, disconnected not only from the world but from the essence of who they had once been. The lack of human connection in the asylum was perhaps one of its cruelest features. Many of the patients had been removed from the world they had once known, their families, their communities, their livelihoods. For those who had once been actively engaged in society, their lives had suddenly been reduced to solitary confinement in a bleak room, a place where they were neither seen nor heard. The outside world had all but forgotten them, and the asylum, in its cold efficiency, offered no means of connection or respite. The patients' cries for help, both physical and emotional, went largely unanswered. In a society that viewed them as burdens, the asylum was the final, crushing blow to any sense of self-worth they had left. For many of these patients, the isolation was not simply an emotional weight, it was a suffocating, physical presence. The architecture of the asylum itself reinforced this sense of separation. The walls of the cells were thick and oppressive, designed to isolate the patients from one another and from the outside world. The small, cold rooms left little room for movement, and the iron bars that barred the windows served as a constant reminder of the confinement. The lack of natural light, the dampness of the stone floors, and the constant chill that permeated the air made the asylum feel more like a tomb than a place of healing. In such an environment, it was impossible for patients to maintain any semblance of dignity or self-worth. It was easy for them to forget who they were, as the institution seemed to care little for the individual. They were treated as problems to be solved, not people to be understood. The emotional toll of isolation in the asylum was profound. Patients who had once been capable of forming relationships, of nurturing connections with loved ones, were left to struggle in an environment where human interaction was sparse and discouraged. In many cases, patients who were deemed violent or uncooperative were isolated even further, locked away in small, windowless rooms where they were left in the dark for days on end. These patients, stripped of any meaningful contact with the outside world, often experienced extreme psychological distress. For those who had previously been stable and engaged in the world, this sudden loss of connection could be devastating. The lack of communication, coupled with the sensory deprivation, often led to a breakdown of their sense of self. Isolation, when extended over long periods, has the power to fracture the human psyche. Those who had been strong, independent individuals were now reduced to broken, fearful shadows of who they had once been. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the patients' mental states deteriorated further. The asylum, which was intended to offer healing, became the catalyst for their unraveling. The combination of physical neglect, emotional abandonment, and psychological trauma created an environment where the patients had little hope of recovery. The silence of the asylum was suffocating, a constant reminder of the void that had swallowed their identities. They were no longer seen as people, but as problems to be erased. This loss of personhood was perhaps one of the most insidious aspects of their confinement. For patients like Anna, a former schoolteacher who had been diagnosed with what was called melancholia, likely depression, the effects of isolation were particularly devastating. Anna had lived a full life before her commitment to the asylum. She had been an educator, deeply involved in her community, with a network of friends and family who cared for her. But after the sudden death of her husband, Anna had fallen into a deep despair. Her once vibrant personality began to fade as she withdrew from the world. Unable to cope with the loss and the overwhelming sadness that consumed her, Anna's family, fearing for her well-being, brought her to the asylum, hoping that she could be restored to her former self. Anna's entry into the asylum was a turning point. She was immediately separated from her family and placed in a small, isolated cell. The other patients in the institution were often unpredictable, their emotional states fluctuating wildly, and Anna found herself surrounded by individuals whose suffering was far more extreme than her own. The sounds of screams, manic laughter, and desperate cries filled the air, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. The doctors who treated her, not understanding the depth of her grief, used methods that were not just ineffective but damaging. Anna was subjected to forced isolation, physical restraints, and treatments that did little to ease her emotional pain. She was given sedatives that left her numb, as if to dull the sharpness of her sorrow. But no one cared to ask Anna what she needed. No one sought to understand her pain. She was treated as a case to be managed, a diagnosis to be marked off. As the weeks went on, Anna's condition worsened. The isolation became unbearable. She was no longer just mourning the death of her husband. She was mourning the loss of herself. Her once intelligent mind, capable of teaching and engaging in lively debates, began to deteriorate under the weight of isolation and neglect. She became unable to think clearly, her thoughts clouded by the oppressive silence around her. The people who had once known her, the friends who had admired her intellect and kindness, were gone, and she was left in a void. Anna, like so many others, became a forgotten soul, lost to a system that had no place for her grief. The asylum that had been meant to heal her became her prison, one where she would slowly fade away, forgotten by all but the institution itself. As Anna's story illustrates, the emotional and psychological toll of isolation was not just about the deprivation of human contact, it was also about the deep sense of abandonment that patients experienced. This abandonment was not just from family members or loved ones, it was from society itself. The very act of being committed to an asylum was an indication that the individual was no longer considered a functional part of society. They were separated from the world outside, labeled as mentally ill, and cast aside to be forgotten. In a society that stigmatized mental illness, the asylum became the place where people like Anna were discarded. They were no longer seen as valuable individuals with unique needs, but as cases to be confined and controlled. This abandonment, combined with the oppressive environment of the asylum, created a sense of hopelessness that permeated every aspect of the patients' lives. The lack of connection to the outside world made it impossible for many to imagine a life beyond the asylum's walls. Patients who had once dreamed of returning home, of rebuilding their lives, now faced the grim reality that their lives were now bound to the institution. The asylum had become their world, and the outside world had become a distant memory. Over time, the patient's sense of self disintegrated, and they began to lose any hope of ever escaping. The horrors of isolation were compounded by the knowledge that death was always lurking just around the corner. Many patients, particularly those who had been in the asylum for extended periods of time, began to experience a profound sense of inevitability. The concept of recovery seemed increasingly out of reach, and the prospect of returning to a life outside the asylum began to seem like a fantasy. The patients, trapped in a system that viewed them as little more than cases to be managed, began to lose their will to live. The isolation, the neglect, and the despair pushed many to the brink of self-destruction. Some patients turned to self-harm as a means of coping with their suffering, while others simply gave up altogether, surrendering to the idea that they would never again see the light of day. For those who did manage to hold on to some sense of hope, the asylum's oppressive environment was a constant reminder of their powerlessness. The absence of any real therapeutic care, the lack of compassion from the staff, and the overall neglect they suffered left them with little to cling to. Their days were marked by a numbing routine, medications administered, meals eaten in silence, and hours spent alone in their cells. There was little to offer the patients but the slow passage of time, and with each passing day, they became more and more removed from the people they had once been. It was a slow death, one that could not be seen on the outside, but was felt deeply within. The asylum, which was supposed to be a place of healing, had become a place where patients were left to die, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, and psychologically. The loss of hope was the final blow, the one that sealed their fate within the cold, unforgiving walls of the institution. The lives of the patients in the asylum were shaped not only by isolation and neglect, but also by the insidious routines imposed upon them by the institution. From the moment they entered, the daily schedule was a relentless machine, designed not for recovery, but for control. Every aspect of a patient's life was dictated by the rules of the asylum. They were awakened, fed, treated, and confined according to strict schedules that left little room for individuality, spontaneity, or personal expression. The structure of the day, far from offering comfort or stability, became another instrument of oppression, a constant reminder that the patients were under complete surveillance, their lives no longer their own. Each hour, each movement, each thought could be monitored, judged, and corrected by the staff. The routines within the asylum were rigid to the point of cruelty. Patients were often woken at dawn, regardless of their mental state or physical condition. There was no accommodation for exhaustion, anxiety, or the deep despair many felt after nights filled with nightmares and hallucinations. The mornings began with cold baths, administered with little regard for comfort or dignity. These baths, ostensibly meant to cleanse and refresh, often left patients shivering in the icy water, trembling not just from the cold, but from the creeping fear of what the day would bring. Breakfast followed, typically a meager portion of bread, porridge, or thin soup. There was no variation, no nourishment tailored to individual needs. Hunger and malnutrition became a constant companion for many, weakening their bodies and further exacerbating their fragile mental states. After the morning routine, patients were subjected to treatments that were at once brutal and indiscriminate. Doctors and attendants carried out procedures without much understanding of the individuals before them. Electroconvulsive therapy, crude and unregulated, was applied to anyone deemed unmanageable or in need of intervention. Physical restraints were another daily fixture, often applied not because a patient was violent, but because they displayed behavior that staff found inconvenient or disruptive. Even simple acts of emotional expression, crying, shouting, or displaying signs of grief, were often met with punishment. The staff viewed these reactions as problems to be contained rather than expressions of suffering to be understood. Over time, the patients learned that to survive, they had to suppress any natural human response, burying fear, pain, and grief deep within themselves. This suppression did not protect them. It only intensified the psychological torment, creating a slow, invisible erosion of their sanity. The dining routines, seemingly simple, were another source of suffering. Meals were often taken in communal halls under the watchful eye of the staff. Patients who failed to eat, who refused to consume the meager rations offered, were subjected to punishment or forced feeding. The act of eating, normally a private and comforting ritual, became a source of humiliation and fear. The quality of the food was poor, lacking in both nutrients and taste. Patients who were already weakened by neglect and illness often found their physical health deteriorating further. Malnutrition, coupled with the lack of medical care for basic ailments, left many vulnerable to disease and infection. The daily routine of food and feeding, instead of restoring strength, became another mechanism by which the asylum slowly consumed its inhabitants. Beyond these basic needs, the patients were forced into activities designed to maintain the appearance of order and productivity. Some were assigned tasks such as cleaning, scrubbing floors, or performing menial labor around the facility. These tasks were rarely therapeutic. They were more about control than rehabilitation. The patients were constantly reminded that they were under scrutiny, that any deviation from the expected behavior could result in punishment. The work offered no dignity, no sense of accomplishment, only the constant reminder that their lives were no longer their own. Even those who might have previously held positions of influence or skill in the outside world were reduced to performing tasks that stripped them of agency and self-worth. The asylum erased their pasts, their capabilities, and their potential, leaving only the hollow routines imposed by the institution. The patients' attempts at forming bonds with one another were heavily restricted. Social interaction was limited and monitored, discouraged unless it could be contained within the institution's rigid rules. Friendships were fleeting, often destroyed by the need to control the environment or by the unpredictable behavior of fellow patients who were themselves struggling with despair and mental instability. In this environment, trust was nearly impossible to establish. Patients learned to isolate themselves emotionally as well as physically, to protect what little remained of their sense of self from further erosion. Human connection, one of the few potential sources of comfort, was denied or rendered toxic by the oppressive systems in place. Even the most basic personal routines, like dressing or hygiene, were regimented and intrusive. Patients were often forced to wear uniforms that stripped them of individuality, turning them into faceless components of the asylum machine. Their privacy was non-existent. Baths, toileting, and medical examinations were conducted under constant observation. The staff's priority was not the patient's comfort or dignity, but the maintenance of order and the demonstration of control. Every aspect of life was a performance for the staff's benefit, leaving the patient stripped of autonomy and forced to navigate a world entirely dictated by external authority. Over time, the repetitive, dehumanizing schedules contributed to a sense of learned helplessness, where patients no longer even attempted to assert control over their lives because they had internalized the institution's total dominance. Mental deterioration was accelerated by the lack of stimulating or meaningful activity. The patients' minds, deprived of creative outlets or intellectual engagement, often turned inward, magnifying fears, regrets, and obsessions. Hallucinations and delusions became increasingly common, fueled by sensory deprivation, enforced monotony, and the oppressive silence of the halls. Many patients began to speak of unseen figures, voices, or presences that haunted them, phenomena that staff dismissed as symptoms of madness, failing to understand that these experiences were often intensified by the asylum's cruel routines. The more the patients were cut off from meaningful engagement, the more their minds created alternate realities as a desperate coping mechanism, blurring the line between perception and hallucination. The psychological toll of the asylum's routines cannot be overstated. Even minor deviations from the imposed schedule could lead to punishment, which ranged from solitary confinement to the increased use of restraints. Patients became hyper-aware of the rules, walking on eggshells around staff, constantly fearing retribution for small infractions or emotional outbursts. This constant surveillance created a climate of terror, where the patient's mental energy was spent on compliance and self-preservation rather than recovery or healing. The institution, by its very design, became a place where despair was systematically embedded into every moment of daily life. The relentless structure of routines was not stabilizing but suffocating, grinding down those inside until the weight of existence itself became unbearable. The predictability of the asylum's routines offered no comfort. Instead of providing stability, the repetitive cycles of rigid control reinforced the sense of inescapability. Patients quickly realized that nothing they did could change their circumstances. The daily monotony, punctuated by arbitrary punishment and harsh treatments, reinforced the feeling that their lives were entirely at the mercy of an uncaring institution. This sense of powerlessness was compounded by the knowledge that death often awaited many of the long-term patients. The asylum, which had been presented as a sanctuary for healing, became a place where life was gradually stripped away, hour by hour, day by day. Many patients began to internalize the institution's oppressive control, believing that their fates were sealed. They no longer attempted to resist the rigid rules or assert themselves because they had learned that such actions were futile. In psychological terms, this was a form of learned helplessness, a state in which individuals come to believe that they are powerless to change their circumstances, even when opportunities for action exist. In the asylum, this mental state was exacerbated by the daily routines, which offered no reward for initiative and punished any form of self-expression. The patients were not just isolated physically, they were mentally conditioned to accept their fate, to succumb to the institution's machinery without protest. This psychological conditioning was as insidious as any physical restraint or isolation chamber, creating a generation of patients whose very will to live was systematically eroded. Even those patients who initially displayed resilience or hope often succumbed to the crushing weight of the asylum systems. Take the case of Joseph, a man committed after a nervous breakdown caused by the death of his wife. Initially, Joseph tried to maintain a sense of agency, engaging in conversations with staff and attempting to keep a journal of his thoughts and memories. But over months of rigid schedules, harsh treatments, and enforced isolation, even his determination began to fade. His journal, confiscated for being unnecessary and disruptive, symbolized the loss of control he faced in every aspect of his life. With each passing day, the asylum chipped away at his identity and autonomy, leaving him as a shell of the man who had once been capable of love, ambition, and creativity.